received this week as I was preparing for this message. And we're continuing this series that grace is greater. If you remember, I said last week we need to set aside our assumption of what we think grace is, and we need to really look at what the Bible says grace is. And so often we have this assumption. I was talking to someone, and they said, I talked to someone, and they said, grace is anything you don't deserve. I thought, if I go home and my house has been robbed, I didn't deserve that, so that must be grace. So that definition falls short somewhere. And if it's anything we don't deserve, and we leave God out of it, then we don't really understand what grace is, because we have to have the God factor in our definition of grace. That's why we've been running with this definition. Grace is God's riches at Christ's expense. We have to have God in there. It's stuff that we get from God that we don't deserve. It's His riches. It's a relationship with Him. It's His peace. It's His provision for us. Just His incredible love for us, that relationship. But we didn't do anything to earn it. Christ did all the work. And so that's why we've been using that definition. And yet sometimes we look at life and we go, that's not fair. I don't have what they have. Or sometimes we think quietly, I wish I was better, because then I could be more accepted by people. Life would be easier if I was better. It's kind of like when pastors get together. You guys might not realize how human we are, but one of the biggest challenges of pastors getting together is when you have pastors getting together, oh, yeah, how does your church go? Because we usually know which church the pastors are connected to, but so how did Sunday go? And people are like, well, I don't want to say we had 8 salvations when that person didn't even have 8 people in their church. And there's this comparison thing that goes on. But over time, as our group of pastors have met every week for prayer, we've all come to an understanding it doesn't matter how big or small our church is. It doesn't matter what happens. We're in it together. And so if I see success over here, and they had 50 people respond to Jesus Christ, we've been praying for them, so that's part of our success. And if this person's struggling because they just had 5 families leave and they don't know what they're going to do, that's part of our weakness. Because we're connected and we're part of the family of God. But we need to be able to share those things. And it reminds me of a story that I read recently, a story of a 10-year-old boy. This 10-year-old boy was in a devastating car accident. And as a result of that devastating car accident, he lost his left arm. Didn't have anything from the shoulder on down. Not even a little nub he could wave around. It was just, he lost the whole thing. And as he recovered, as part of his physical therapy, he got really interested in judo. He thought, I need to learn judo. Judo will help me concentrate. It'll help me get back into shape. I need to learn judo. And so he found a mannequin and stuck that arm in his sleeve. No, okay, he didn't do that. He didn't try to cover up his weakness. Because it'd be stupid to walk into a judo class with this mannequin arm. But he went and he found a teacher, a sensei, who was willing to teach him. And he was super excited. And as he started learning, the Japanese teacher kept teaching him the same move over and over and over again. And he thought, well, I'm getting this move done really good, but I've been doing this for 6 months. And finally he worked up the courage and he said, Sensei, why after 6 months am I still learning one move? Shouldn't I be learning other things about judo by now? And the sensei said, this one move is the only move you'll ever need to learn. So learn it well. Okay, it's one of those, Karate Kid moments, the one move. Several months later, the sensei enrolled him in a local judo competition. And the boy was excited. It was his first competition. And surprising himself, the boy easily won his first 2 matches using his one move. He thought, wow, this is great. And then because he had won those first 2 matches, he was all of a sudden in the finals. He thought, wow, I get to be in the finals. And wait a second, I get to be in the finals and I see who I'm up against. And it was a guy about twice his size, a lot more experience than he had. And they started out and there was difficulty at the beginning of the match, and they were pretty closely scored, yeah. Pretty closely scored to one another. And then finally the opportunity came, and he saw his opportunity because the guy he was going against was getting frustrated. He was bigger, he was stronger, he had both his arms, he should be able to beat this little puny punk. And so, in a little bit of a rage, he charged, and he saw his chance. I can use my one move now. And he used his one move, and he pinned this guy, winning the match, which also meant he won the tournament. So he was undefeated in the tournament, he won the tournament, and on the way home he goes, Sensei, I don't understand it. He taught me one move, and I won the tournament. He goes, I told you it was the one move you needed to learn, and you needed to learn it well. He goes, why was I able to beat people who are bigger and stronger and faster than I am? And the Sensei said, that one move is what may let you win, isn't it? Yes. Yes, Sensei. Well, there's no known defense against that move except grabbing the left arm of the man who's trying to do it. Remember, he had no left arm? So, the one move took someone's weakness and made it their strength. Grace, when it encounters our life, God wants to take every weakness we have and make it a strength if we will let that grace flood in and make the difference. And to help us remember, I want to go back to our key verse of this series. And that is simply this. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15 says, see to it that no one misses the grace of God. See to it that no one misses the grace of God. And that goes on to finish the verse by saying, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. If we miss the grace of God, it doesn't matter what we're doing, a bitter root will grow up and it will cause people to be defiled, or in this context, bitterness is poisonous. It's the same word that was used. And so the defilement is actually the severe hurting or death of many. And we talked about the fact that you can you can apply that to any situation, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a job, whether it's school, whether it's some kind of leisure thing that you love to do, whether it's you just look at all those things, whether it's church. You take grace out of any of those, and it makes it bitter or poisonous to the people, and all of a sudden it causes pain and hurt. And so we want to make sure that no one misses the grace of God. No one misses the grace of God. And when we talk about God's grace colliding with our life, we call it a beautiful collision. Because always beauty comes out of it. It's always something that makes such a difference that God will take what we think is completely a hopeless situation, and he'll make it something so beautiful that it attracts other people to it. And so today we want to look at the beautiful collision of grace being greater than weakness. Grace being greater than weakness. And as we look at this, you're going to see that there's lots of kind of weaknesses. But we're going to be looking at how that applies to our life. And we have two portions of Scripture we're going to look at. So I want you to open up to the book of Mark. Matthew, Mark chapter 5. And I want you to stick your finger in Mark chapter 5 because we're going to come back to that. But then I also want you to flip over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And as you turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, I want to give you a little bit of background about the city and the area of Corinth. Corinth was one of those cities that was known for its grandeur. In fact, if you look at the Corinthian style architecture, it was always bigger and bolder and quote-unquote stronger than anything else. They were known for their elaborate and overuse of giant pillars. That was part of the Corinthian style of architecture. And on the top of the pillars, there were these ornate carvings that just showed the glory and the power and the strength of Corinth. And they also had a huge temple, and one of the biggest industries in the town was the temple prostitutes. And yet it was all based around, look how grand we are, look how powerful we are. And I want you to understand that because in some ways, America is a lot like this. We idolize and worship strength and power. We focus on those things that seems to be super successful in our eyes. And we ignore the weak. And Paul is writing to the people in Corinth because what had happened between his letters, which is 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, they're two separate letters. What had happened is in the church, some people had come in and they said, we need to buy into the idea of Corinth where power and achievement and success and strength is our standard. So we are going to boast about how smart we are, how well studied we are, what kind of great people we are, and so you need to listen to us. And so Paul is dealing with that. And if you pick up in verse 11, you see Paul, he says he's being foolish or crazy. Because he goes on to say, and I'll just start reading verse 11. Have I made a fool of myself? But you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I am not in the least inferior to the super apostles, even though I am nothing. The things that mark an apostle, signs and wonders and miracles, were done among you with great perseverance. How are you inferior to the other churches, except that I was never a burden to you? Forgive me for this wrong. And you have to understand, he's kind of poking fun at him. So when he says, oh, I wasn't a burden to you, forgive me for not being a burden to you, he's trying to get their attention. He's trying to kind of jibe them into reality check, because they were trying to follow the super apostles, the special people. And he goes on to say, now that I'm ready to visit you for a third time, I will not be a burden to you, because what I want is not your possessions, but you. After all, children should not have to save up for their parents, the parents for their children. So I will very gladly spend for each of you everything I have, and expend myself as well. If I love you more, will you love me less? Be that as it may, and I want you to see how he turns from being a fatherly figure here. He says, be that as it may, I have not been a burden to you. Yet crafty fellow that I am, I have taught you by trickery. And he's trying to get their attention again. He goes on to say in verse 17, did I exploit you through any of the men that you sent to me? I urged Titus to go to you, and I sent our brother with him. Titus did not exploit you. He did not. Or did he? Did we not act in the name of the Spirit and follow the same course? Now verse 19, it says, you've been thinking all along that we have been defending ourselves to you. We have been speaking in the sight of God as those in Christ. Did I flip over too far? I'm sorry, I started reading in the wrong chapter. No one called me on it. I was reading chapter 12, starting verse 11. We're supposed to be 11, verse 16. Yeah, now I'm getting a thumbs up. Okay, Pastor Rob. You confused all of us for 3 minutes. Have you noticed that I'm not perfect? I have no weaknesses. I read in the wrong place. I'm going to go back to chapter 11, verse 16.
We needed to hear that other verse.
I'm sure God will apply it. But go back to chapter 11, starting in verse 16. He says, I repeat, let no one take me for a fool. Now it's interesting because he says fool there, and then he goes, I'm talking like a fool. He wants people to know that what he's about to say isn't real. He's still trying to jibe them into a reality check here. And he says, but if you do, then receive me just as you would a fool, so that I may do a little boasting. In this self-confident boasting, I'm not talking as the Lord, but as a fool. Since many are boasting in a way that the world does, I too will boast. You gladly put up with fools, since you are so wise. In fact, you even put up with anyone who enslaves you or exploits you, or takes advantage of you, or pushes himself forward, or slaps you in the face. To my shame, I admit that we are too weak for that. Now, do you get the sarcasm in what he's saying? He's saying this church, the church that he helped start, the church in Corinth, they were accepting all this stuff that was abusive because there was no grace in it. And he goes, you guys accept that, so I'm going to play the fool for a little while. Since you already accept it, listen to me while I join in with the foolishness. And then picking up, he says, in the rest of verse 21, what anyone else dares to boast about, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast about it. Are they Hebrews? So am I. And you have to understand, you can become a Hebrew by purchasing the right to be a Hebrew, or you can be born a Hebrew. Paul was born a Hebrew. And so he had more right to boast and be foolish about it. He goes on to say, are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm out of my mind to talk like this. I am more a servant of Christ. Have I worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged severely, been exposed to death again and again? 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. I want you to think about that concept for a second. 5 times Paul received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. That is what Jesus received before he went to the cross. And if they had done the 40th lash, by Roman law they were considered dead because no one had ever survived it. And Paul had received the 39 lashes 5 times. And you think you suffered for Christ? Look at me. And he says he's a fool to talk like this, but let's go back. Verse 25. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have constantly been on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from the Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false brothers. I have labored and toiled and often gone without sleep. And he's doing all this to show I could boast. I know my strengths. But when it comes to God's grace and eternity, my strength means nothing. That's what he goes on to say. My strength means nothing, and that's actually our first point. As we look at the rest of this and what he says, knowing our strength is fine, but it's not important where grace is concerned. Because strength tends to push grace out of the way, saying, I earned this, I did it by myself, therefore I am good enough. If you can earn it, then it's not grace. Grace is God's riches at Christ's expense. Christ had to earn what we have. We can't do it. Legalism, religiousness, ritual, that's what our trying to earn something is. God's grace said he gave it all to us. So our strength, it's good to know your strength. But if you focus on your strength and you think that's going to get you a higher position in heaven, a bigger mansion when you get there, nicer gold on the streets where you're living, you'd be confused by that. Paul actually goes on to say, all these strengths are great, but they don't mean anything. In verse 12, if you go down to chapter 12, not verse 12, chapter 12, it says, must I go on boasting, although there is nothing to be gained? Will I go on, or I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man, and it's interesting because he's talking about his vision and his revelation from the Lord, but then he doesn't refer to his own name. He's the man who was caught up into the third heaven. He's the man who got to see the glories of heaven that are described here. In verse 3, and I know this man, whether in body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up into paradise. He heard inexpressible things that man is not permitted to tell. I'll boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself except about my weaknesses. Paul had learned a really important story, even though he was, by man's standard, this incredible human being. He had survived what most people could never survive. He was smarter than most of his countrymen because he was slated before his salvation to be the next religious leader of Israel. He was studying under Gamaliel, who was the religious teacher of Israel. He was the highest pinnacle, Gamaliel was, of Judaism in Israel at the time, and Paul was his star student. He had a knowledge base that most of us couldn't comprehend. He had the wisdom and the intellect, but he goes, I'm not going to boast about anything except, look at the end of verse 5. I will not boast about myself except about my weaknesses. And even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, or would I not be a fool? Because I would be speaking Or I would not be fooled because I'd be speaking the truth. But I refrain so that no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I say or what I do. As you look at this, Paul doesn't want anyone to focus on him for his ability and his strength. And yet our culture celebrates that, exalts that. We pay people ridiculous amounts of money because we think their ability and their strength deserves it. Or at least they think their ability and strength deserves it. I was reading about a football player who was killed this past week, and it was sad, and they were talking about, at one time he held a contract for $40 million. For 4 years. That's a lot of money for 4 years. They were exalting someone because of their ability and strength, but physical ability and strength is fleeting. It's going to go. So we shouldn't boast about that. But here Paul says, let's stop boasting about that. Let's turn and let's focus on what's most important. Let's boast about our weaknesses. And if you go on to read, it says, I just read up to verse 7, it says, to keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassing great revelations, there was given to me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord, take this away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why for Christ's sake I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul had learned the reverse idea that Jesus taught. The least will be the greatest. The weakest will be the strongest. Those who cry out for mercy will find justice. And here we're taught that we need to highlight and celebrate weakness. Not that the weakness in itself is a great thing, because how many of us love the weakness that we find in ourselves? None of us, if we're sane. But the fact that God's grace can shine through that, that's what we should celebrate. Because where I'm strong, by default of being a human being, I don't think I need God's help where I'm strong. I got this handled. That this is my operating procedure. I got this handled. I'm smart. I can figure this out, God. I got it handled. And 4 hours later, maybe 4 months later, I realized that one little connection wasn't made, and it would have made everything work, but I was too smart to ask for help because I got this handled, God. And God said, if you just admitted you didn't know what was going on and asked for help, I would have pushed the button a lot sooner. But we go on with this idea that we are sufficient. And we're not. And our second point this morning is simply this. Grace is greater than weakness because it puts a premium on it. You know what it means to put a premium on something? It means it's more valuable than everything else. And you strive for that. Why would grace put a premium on weakness? Well, I've said it a couple of times already. It puts a premium on weakness because it keeps the focus on God and what He has done and what He's doing, and not on us. Paul talked about all these things that happened to him, things that he could quote unquote boast about. But he didn't care about any of those things because it wasn't about what he could survive or what he could do. It's about what God was doing in and through him that was important. We need to let God do stuff in and through us. When grace is applied to our weakness, it makes us useful, beautiful, and more valuable to Him and others than we could ever imagine possible. I want you to think about that for a second. When there's that beautiful collision of grace and weakness, it makes us beautiful, useful, and more valuable to God and to others. There's 3 examples of this that I want to bring to your attention. Because as we think about these examples, I want you to realize that we need to stop keeping our weaknesses a secret so that God can shine through them. The first example is from a book that Corrie ten Boom wrote. And she was writing this book about her journeys around the world. And if you know anything about her, she survived the World War II death camps. And she had this incredible ministry of God's grace around the world as she went to talk about forgiveness to people and the need for them to forgive. And she did this right after World War II when a lot of people were still suffering from what was done during that time. And she remembers going to Russia and visiting a family, and she was horrified at first when she walked into their little apartment. Because here's this little old man, he's about 70 years of age, and there he is, a doting, loving husband to his crippled wife. She was so crippled that all she could do was lay on her one side, and the only thing she could move besides blinking her eyes and swallowing when her husband fed her was to move one hand and one finger. And as she watched, she realized that this lady was slowly typing. And her husband would change up the pages and he'd put stuff in. And what she was doing is she was slowly translating the Word of God into the local dialect in Russia. And this broke Corrie ten Boom's heart. She goes, we should just pray for healing for your wife, to see her suffer so much. And her husband said, this isn't suffering, this is God's grace. And Corey goes, what on earth are you talking about? I know about God's grace. How is your wife suffering and not able to move? God's grace. He goes, because every other Christian in the city is watched and rated on a regular basis. But my wife has been so sick for so long that they know she can't do anything, so no one ever comes and checks on us. She's the only one who has the freedom to translate the Bible whenever she wants. God took a weakness and made it a strength, where His grace could shine through. And here's this lady who is translating the Word of God for her people. What a beautiful picture. It's kind of like the Japanese art of kintsugi. And I'm probably saying it wrong, but kintsugi. And I have a couple of examples of kintsugi because it's this incredible practice that they've been doing for 1,500 years or so, where they take broken pottery. And instead of throwing out the broken pottery, they take gold and use it to fix the broken pottery. So they take something that was useful, then became garbage, and then they added something valuable to it to make it useful again. And in making it useful again, it makes it more beautiful and way more valuable, because you now have pottery that is infused with gold. And so here's a couple of examples, and I have another example up there that I want you to pop to, because my favorite one is the top right, the one with the green on, but they're all beautiful. And this was all garbage before they decided to add this thing of value. Sometimes as we go through life, we think our life is just garbage. And then God says, let me add grace to it. You might think your life is broken and beyond repair. There's no point to even trying anymore. And God says, let me add grace to it. And as I add grace to it, it will reshape and it'll fix you, it'll make you useful again, but you'll be more useful, more beautiful, and more value than before you were broken. Before you knew your weaknesses, I'll make you so much better if you let me apply my grace. And I love this picture. You might be going, Pastor, how can I relate to a piece of pottery? Well, unless you're broken like a piece of pottery and you have gold going through you, okay, you can't. But we can look at people whose lives are broken by everyone else's opinion. And then we can see how God's grace steps in. And I've asked someone in our church to come up and share. So, Tammy, if you'd come up and share. Tammy's life, and I'll let her talk more about it because she knows all the details. I don't even know all the details. I know a little bit of the cracks, but I don't know how many cracks there are. And so I would like you to be able to share. You want? I'm not far this will go. I want you just to be able to share about your life, some of the broken aspects, and then what God has done as His grace has come in and put you back together.
There's a lot of storms, a lot of cracks, and He's still healing some of those. I have a son who we went through cancer with him for 6 years, and I didn't know what the purpose was for that. Now I am dealing with all of my personal stuff. I have 4 autoimmune diseases that leave me in a lot of pain. One of them is actually in a flare right now, and I am like allergic to my whole world. Um, so I'm struggling with that. And I mean, there are days that I don't even know if I can get out of bed. And when all of this first started, I would lay in my bed, curled in the fetal position, and cry. And I would be like, why? And then I started dealing with this, and I was like, I need to have a purpose. Why are you, just give me a purpose for all of this. I have RA, I have fibro, I'm a diabetic, and then I have what's called mast cell activation. That's the new one that's just come at me within the last year that makes me allergic to just about everything. And the doctors can't really treat it. They don't know how. And so I struggled, and I would lay there and cry. And then God started, and then I have this thing, it's let go and let God. And trust Him. That's my word. Trust. And I started trusting Him and letting go, because I'm kind of a control freak and I'm a little OCD. And it was hard, to let go of myself. I turned my children over to Him, my family, all that. But it's hard to let, the physical things a lot of you have a lot of chronic pain and illnesses and those types of things, and it's hard. And when I let go, the strength that He poured into me that allows me to even stand here. There are some days I'm on a walker. There's some days I don't leave my house. I stay in my jammies curled up in a blanket. And I can't leave the house. But God has a purpose. He's given me that purpose, and He showed me what that is. And now He's going to be birthing a ministry out of me that is going to reach into the lives of others, and I get to share that. And I get to share the strength that He gives me every single day to just stand here. Do I still curl up and cry? You bet. But He's still, every day, I get up every day and I trust Him. And I look around my world and I see all the miracles that He has every day. Okay? I got one today. I got to hold Mercy, and I just clung to that, and the strength, I just fed off of that. The strength from a baby, just, because I love babies. But even that, just the miracles that we see every day. And I feed off of those, and I gather strength from those. And now that He's given me a purpose, He tells me, and have we prayed over all this? Yes. I've been anointed, we have prayed, we still pray. And He tells me that it is not time for me to be healed, because He has a purpose. I went to a retreat one time, and the lady was speaking, and she says, we need to come to the point where we say thank you for all of our illnesses. And I'm like, not. No, there's not a thank you in there for this. It's too hard. There's so much pain. And my whole life I now have frozen shoulder, and so just reaching out and turning off a light switch is a struggle for me. But the last day of the retreat, I was reading my Bible, and I was praying, and He showed me all of the things that He's done. And I was able to say thank you. And I still say thank you every day for the things, for all of the pain, because of the people that I have been able to reach while I'm going through this. So it's hard. And once you let go and let Him and you trust Him. A couple weeks ago, I got called back in for a second mammogram. And we struggled all week. We had a lot of people praying, but I didn't have to. I said, God, I trust You. Whatever You ask me to go through, I will go through. Because I know He has a purpose for it. And grace is what He pours into me and gives me the strength to deal with my weaknesses. And He'll do the same for you. You just have to put grace in. And then you'll have the strength to go through whatever. Whether it's for a moment or it's for the rest of your life.
I want to highlight the gold in the pottery that was there. Because Tammy mentioned she's broken in a bunch of different ways. There's a lot of cracks, a lot of weakness. And God's grace came in and took pointlessness and made it purpose. Took pain and made it purpose. She has a purpose. She has a ministry to other people who are going through the similar thing, and she's been there. She's able to say without arrogance or stupidity, been there, done that. So here's how I survived. And let me come alongside and help you. And God has birthed this ministry in her to come alongside people to help her, because if there wasn't a point for her weakness, then she could get bitter. And that goes back to, without God's grace, a root of bitterness can grow up. We need to make sure that we let God's grace come into anything. In any situation. And when it happens, His grace will take what looks like a hopeless, pointless situation, and He will make it full of purpose and meaning. And to help us understand that again, I want us to flip back over. Remember, you're supposed to put your finger in Mark chapter 5. Hopefully you have your finger there, because Mark chapter 5 tells an amazing story of someone who had an incredible weakness. And that weakness was changed, and it ended up with purpose. And so I love the fact that Tammy went there, because that's where we're going at the end of this message. But it says, and some of you know this story, it's the story of Jesus encountering a demon-possessed man. That's a weakness no one wants to flaunt, but in his case, everyone knew he had that weakness. And it says this: they went across the lake. I'm reading Mark chapter 5, verse 1. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus got out of a boat, a man with an evil spirit came up to him from the tombs. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with chains. For he had been often chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. Talk about being in a bad situation with a lot of weaknesses. And weaknesses that no one else could help with. He was bound by something that wasn't letting him go. And when other people tried to control it, they couldn't control it either. You know, as I look at that, the thing that rings true to me today, something that falls into that same category, that isn't demon possession, but it binds people, and they can't break out of it. It causes them to do things that might hurt their bodies, and they call out in pain, and no one else can come in and control it. It's the addictions that we see in society today. People who are struggling with alcoholism or drug addiction, and there's so many different types of drug addictions these days. And we could go on to talk about any addiction that has control of your life. This is what we're looking at, but this man was demon-possessed. Let's go back, and in verse 6 it says this: when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell at his feet in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? Swear to God that you will not torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you evil spirit." There was a beautiful grace collision happening at the edge of a lake near a cemetery. A man who thought life was over and everyone else had written him off because no one could do anything to help him, encountered the one who could make all the difference, the source of grace. And so we see this collision happening, and it looks like it's going to get messy because no one can control this, and it did get messy. I mean, if we go on to read in verse 9, it says, then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." Then he begged Jesus again not to send him out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the hillside was feeding on a nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the evil spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Now, I've seen pig farms. I've never seen a pig farm with 2,000 pigs on it. Talk about a messy collision. These demons leave because the grace and power of God is there. They go into these pigs, and all 2,000 of them commit suicide together. because the demons made the pigs go insane and they went and drowned themselves. All of a sudden you have 2,000 bobbing pigs in the lake. Talk about a mess. Let's go on to read. In verse 14 it says this. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this to the town, or in the town in the countryside. And the people went out to see what happened. Yeah, I'm sure they ran. Hey, we were in charge of the pigs and they're all dead now. Well, what happened? This Jesus guy showed up and he said something to the insane guy from the cemetery, and all of a sudden the pigs went crazy and drowned themselves. Like, really? Really? We got to go see what happened for ourselves, because that doesn't make any sense at all. But it says that they went out to see what happened. Verse 15, when they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. I want you to think about that. God's grace had this collision with a man who they had written off. There was no hope for him. There was no point in even trying to approach him. He was a hopeless case. No one could help him. And they came and they saw him in his right mind, fully dressed, at Jesus' feet. What kind of person has that kind of power? It makes sense that they were afraid. Who cares about the pigs at this point? We've been trying all his life to get this man free, and no one can help. He breaks chains that are on his hands and ankles. Just rips them apart. This doesn't make any sense. And Jesus just standing there, and this guy's at his feet, dressed and in his same mind. And they were afraid. And then it goes on to say, verse 16, those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man, and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave the region. They wanted him out of there. We couldn't control him, and you fixed him. That means we can't control you either. We don't want you around. They didn't understand the beautiful collision of grace. They just saw the aftermath of it. And instead of seeing the beauty, they became afraid. Hopefully, we will never become afraid of the beautiful collision of God's grace with our lives. Hopefully, that will never happen. But as we go on to read, it says in verse 18, as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, go home to your family and tell how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you. So the man went away and began to tell the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And all the people were amazed. All the people were amazed. And you might be going, Pastor Rob, how does that tie in with what we're looking at? Yeah, a man was demon-possessed. His weakness was this thing that he couldn't break out of. And he compared it to addictions today. And yes, that is true. A lot of addictions people can't break out of on their own. I could have testimony after testimony of people who struggle with varying degrees and varying styles of addiction. Whether it's over-the-counter medication that they're addicted to, painkillers and other things, whether it's harder, quote-unquote, drugs that you can get, whether it's that friendly herb that's now legalized in Washington State. But these people go, we're addicted and we can't control it, and it's controlling us. Or it could be something as simple as gluttony. Now, don't talk about that. We have potluck, Pastor Al. Gluttony. There's nothing wrong with going to potluck and enjoying food, but if you have to just keep cramming it in you, there's a problem. We could talk about pornography, and it is the largest addictive force in our nation today. And it's about to take over, and this is kind of sad, but it's about to take over as a top money earner for criminals from the drug trade. But it's addictive. And we need to understand as we look at this man's story that grace is greater than weakness, than the weaknesses we can't overcome. It's greater than that. Now, do you believe it? And more importantly, after that, are you going to act on it? I can't tell, because the Bible doesn't specify, if the man in a quote-unquote sane moment saw Jesus and came because he knew he needed help, or if the demons were just afraid and they knew they had already been spotted, so there's no way to get away, so they might as well just come and face Jesus anyway. But here's this man who had no hope, who was completely bound by what was going on. And God said, I can break that situation. And those situations, those weaknesses that we can't overcome, those addictions, these include reputations that people have given us, what other people think about us because of the actions we've done in the past. We talked a little bit about that, where we let shame redefine us so that we're not known as who we are, but we're known by what we've done. I know a gentleman, I mentioned him a couple times before. His first name is Dan. He's a pastor of a church in the Seattle area. It's the second church he pastored. The first one grew into about 800, and then he felt, God, I'm not doing what you want me to do. You want me to evangelize, so I need to go out. I need to evangelize. I need to go where people don't know God, and I need to talk to them. So he went to a part of Seattle that wasn't known for any kind of good religion at all. Started a church. In 3 months, that church was running 600, and 90% of them were brand new converts. He's known to me as this passionate person who loves the lost. Before he got saved, he was known as a murderer. Because he was on death row, all appeals gone, and he was looking at his own execution. And while on death row, a chaplain kept coming to visit him and wouldn't stop coming to visit him. And the chaplain kept saying, let God's grace encounter your life and he can make everything different. You go, how much different can it get? They're not going to put curtains on my cell. I'm stuck here and I'm going to be executed. And he had done it not because he was quote unquote addicted to drugs, but because he worked for those who control the drug trade in the area. And he goes, I deserve to die. I'm going to die. I guess looking into this grace thing can't hurt, but he didn't really think it could help. Well, a couple months later, he surrendered his life. He made that decision that he wanted to make Jesus Christ the Lord of his life. He encountered grace and let it change him. And 4 months after that, he was given a full pardon and walked out a free man. No one knows why. At least no one knew why back then. He knows why now. God had a mission for his life. And God took something that was hopeless, it was about to end, and said, I'm going to breathe new life into this, and you're going to take the hope. Just like this man was sent out, you're going to take the hope of the mercy of God. You're going to get to tell them what I have done for you, and that's going to change lives for eternity. So reputations. I mean, this man, what was his reputation? He was an uncontrolled, insane, demon-possessed man who no one could control, and he was trying to hurt himself as much as he could in the middle of the night, keeping us all awake because he screamed all the time. Okay, that's his reputation. This includes our behavior, where we let habits become addictions. Those uncontrolled weaknesses that we can't overcome. But when grace works, we are made different. And there are 3 things that we can learn from this guy's experience as we wrap things up today. Grace, when grace works, we are made right. The people came and found him in his right mind. He wasn't some babbling idiot. He was in his right mind. He could communicate, he could talk, he could think and intelligently respond. He was in his right mind. And when grace encounters our life, we are made right. Doesn't mean we're made perfect. At least not by the world standards, but we are made right. Think about the examples of people that Tammy isn't free of disease, but she's been made right to be used by God. The little old lady who was crippled all except for one hand and one finger wasn't healed of her disease, but she was made exactly the right way for God to use, where no one else could be used that way. So when we let grace encounter us, when grace works, we are made right according to God's standards. And then we are fully equipped to do what God wants us to do. I have to admit, God has allowed me to be relatively healthy most of my life. And you might think, well, that's a pretty weird thing to say, because we're talking about weaknesses. And that's my point. I can't relate to people who are chronically ill. So, me ministering to them, there's only so much I can do. But you take someone like Tammy, who's been living with it, she can relate and understand, and I can't. So what's my job when someone comes to me and says, I've been struggling with this chronic illness, Pastor Rob, how do I get through it? I say, you know what? God's grace will help you through it, but I know someone who's been walking that path already. Go talk to Tammy. She's been there. She's dealt with the things you're dealing with. Go talk to her. Well, Pastor Rob, I'm facing cancer, and the doctors say there's no hope. You know, I know God does miracles, but I know a man who was given a life sentence of just a couple months. And 30-some years later, he's still sitting in church. Go talk to Jim Lattery, because he wasn't supposed to live more than 6 months after he got that. Go talk to him about how God got him through that. And I can point to person after person because God makes us equipped for what we need to do. Think about it. If the crowd had come and the man was in his right mind sitting at Jesus' feet completely naked still, it'd be kind of an awkward situation. He wouldn't be equipped to go tell people about the glory of God because it would be very distracting. And that's one of those little miracles in the story we don't catch. He was naked among the tombstones, crying out, demon-possessed, hurting himself, and when the crowd came, he was in his right mind, fully dressed. He was equipped to do what God was going to ask him to do, and that's our last little point. When grace works, we are released for service, for the service of telling others of God. It's always about telling others about God. Amen. Look at what God's done for me. If he's done that for me, imagine what he could do for you. And just because someone looks shiny and clean doesn't mean they don't have this incredible story behind their life. Yes, I've been a pastor for 30 years. But I was on my way to prison before God got a hold of my life. I know that for a fact. I was on my way to prison. I was just months away from being arrested and sent to prison. You don't think that looking at me. I mean, Pastor Rob's so nice. He's so clean and shiny. Yeah, God's done a lot of buffing over the years to get me to this stage. And he's still working on those rough spots. But when we let his grace encounter us, we are released for the service of telling others of all that God has done for us. Have you encountered God's grace in your weaknesses so that he will shine through? Like the Apostle Paul says, I boast in my weaknesses because God's grace shines through them.